I welcome my colleague, our VP for Philanthropic Services, Vicki Pugh. She's going to open up this webinar.
Well, good morning, everybody. We are so pleased to have such a great attendance on our webinar today, where we'll talk about shaping responsible investing, incorporating a racial lens. As each of us continue our own journey of learning around racial inequalities, today we will hear from investment professionals who can help us navigate our personal and organizational investments to incorporate a lens of diversity and equity. I want to thank my colleague, Abby Axelrod Wunderman, Director of Charitable Giving, for organizing this webinar today, and our esteemed panel of speakers who will be introduced shortly. I encourage everyone on the call today to learn more about our community foundation and how we work with donors to establish charitable giving funds that assist them in making impactful grants to nonprofit organizations changing lives in our communities. We even have some new personalized philanthropic services to help donors and fund holders plan and facilitate their grant making. To learn more, please visit our website. We have an easy URL to remember. It's yourcommunityfoundation.org. And while you are there, please check out our Racial Equity Hub. It contains many free resources that you can download and use as we all work together to promote racial equity. I'm also going to throw my personal contact information in the chat. Please feel free to reach out to me after this if we can help. And now I would like to welcome my colleague, Abby Axelrod Wunderman, to conduct a brief poll and then introduce our speakers for the webinar today. Again, thank you all for joining us.
Great, thanks, Vicki. That's wonderful. And thank you to all of you who are attending here. It really demonstrates that you're inspired by the growing socially responsible investment movement that's happening and its potential to push new thinking and new actions in organizations and individuals invested in social change. Repairing the frayed social fabric in the United States is one of our most pressing issues. However, it's not only a new problem, it's a problem that we all need to come together to fix. But if we don't address the underlying issues preventing us from achieving equitable growth and inclusion, the economic and social divisions that drove the civil unrest following the murder of George Floyd will become worse. The Community Foundation is working with its CIO to evaluate where we are in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion in our investments, and we are proactively learning and navigating towards a formal statement about race, equity, and diversity in our portfolio. So I thank you for joining us in our learning, and I will share a brief poll so that way we can all know a little bit more about where we're starting here. If you'll take a moment to answer the poll question, this is all anonymous. Where are you in your framework for racial equity, justice, investing? I'll leave it open just a few more seconds. So the majority of you are in the beginning stages, also actively learning with us. And then some of you have some of your investments already implemented, and then others of you are experts already. So I appreciate that. So with this, I'll just say that if you have any questions during today's webinar, you can feel free to drop them in the chat box or in the Q&A. Our panelists will see them in both areas. We have a unique group of speakers with a specialty not only in investments, but also racial justness. The unique acumen that these individuals have and will share with you today will hopefully inspire you and your organizations to become allies in this movement and this framework. So I'll also share a link to speaker bios in the chat once we get started on the panel discussion, so you can read about our speakers if you have not done so already. In the meantime, I'm honored to introduce our moderator, Erica Seth Davies. She has been a nonprofit leader for over 20 years with extensive fundraising, program design, partnership management, and racial equity advocacy experience behind her. She has worked in the field of philanthropy for nearly a decade and has held positions such as Associate Director of Philanthropy at the McDonough School in Georgetown University, Chief of Staff at the Baltimore Community Foundation, and Vice President for External Affairs at ABFE, a philanthropic partnership for Black communities. She is also the founder of the Racial Equity Asset Lab, a venture supported by Common Future, where she is a social entrepreneur in residence. Erica has and continues to engage in extensive efforts to advance this field in issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I am delighted that she is here to join us today. So thank you, Erica.
Thank you so much, Abby. Okay, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me to be with such an amazing group of panelists on a topic that I care deeply about for a whole host of reasons. But before I get started in introducing the panelists, I thought I would open us up with some level setting work, and then I will again introduce our panelists for a discussion today. I appreciate the poll on where people are entering this work at this time, because it actually helps me understand how much level setting would be useful in a conversation. So very few people were taught about this in school. I know the way the history is taught has changed over time. And I usually enter any conversation, again, making no assumptions, but trying to do some level setting and giving people a sense of why this work is important and why some of the decision-making transitions and changes that would need to happen in a process are the way that they are. Next slide. So just from the get-go, just clarifying what we mean about diversity, equity, and inclusion, where diversity can be about optics, but it really just does reflect all the ways in which people might differ in any given situation. And so that might include race, ethnicity, but also religion. And so geography, ability, just a whole set of identifiers that can contribute to that group. Inclusion is what we are referencing to in terms of the seat at the table, the influence, the ability to shape policy and to shape organizational culture, and to do so with intentionality around a value for the diversity that is represented. And then finally, when we're talking about equity, that's the outcome or the result of the diversity that is present, the inclusion in terms of the intentional culture shifts and policy shifts, and understanding the balance of power and how that might have to shift as well. But basically, when we have achieved equity, then this is the result when outcomes are no longer predictable by race, by gender, by geography, that we have resourced and developed strategies in a way that everyone can succeed. Next slide. Oh, was there, can you go back one? Was there a slide? Oh, okay, maybe it wasn't in there. I thought there was a slide with bikes. So you can go to the next slide. So when we're talking about this in the framework of race and racism, it does help to understand what is racism. And it is a system of structuring opportunities and assigning value based on a social interpretation of how we look. Race is a social construct. It's not a biological reality. It was created through policy, through laws, and racism was made structural similarly through policy and through laws. So this isn't something that we're just born with. It's something that we have been taught, and it's been developed over time as a way of concentrating access, opportunity, power, et cetera, in the hands of a few. And it has determined, it has very real consequences in everyone's life and in our society. But this was an intentional baking into the pie of our society at this time. Next slide. And so it manifests in different ways. From the personally mediated, how we interpret all the signals and the symbols and the signs and the messaging that we get from society, again, that have been shaped by policy, and how we take that in and how we view ourselves and view others in the world based on that interpretation of race. That's the personally mediated view. So when people talk about white privilege or implicit bias or internalized oppression, that's, again, how we are pulling things in and how we're processing our view of the world. When that view comes out and it is an interaction with others, that is the interpersonal dynamic of racism. That is the highly visible, or the racist joke, the use of the N-word, the things that make people pause and can be pointed to in terms of individual intent around discrimination, prejudice, or harmful practice. When that is actually codified in a way within an institution, through policy, through practice, or through the ways in which we norm certain behaviors, or the way that we norm the results of process, that's what we're referring to in terms of institutional racism. And that really does not require individual intent, and it doesn't require bad actors to actually continue to generate the results that we have today. And when taken all together, in terms of policy, practice, the ways in which systems interact to create advantage and disadvantage, that shapes our understanding of history, of culture as a society, that's what we're talking about in terms of systemic or structural racism. And how, again, that shapes everything else that's within these other circles as well. So the conversation today is primarily focused on institutional racism, the ways in which asset owners, or foundations in this case, are looking at and allocating their resources, which, to this point, tends to happen in a way that confers advantage on predominantly white men in certain industries, but on whiteness in general. So it's advantage and disadvantage based along the lines of race. But it fits within a lot of, again, that messaging and the way that policy and practice have shaped what we have come to understand as so much of what is normal in this decision-making process, and how that actually shapes bias that reinforces and perpetuates a lot of that, the policy and practice along the way. Next slide. So this is actually another visual that I often share to help people understand that what we see above the surface, again, some of that interpersonal dynamic, the things that are intentional, are very often what people think is the beginning and ending of racism, and that we've moved beyond that, like we're in a post-racial society. But racism as a system, again, that is so deeply embedded in our society, in our economy, reaches far below the surface. And it shows up in a lot of ways that we may not immediately understand or interpret. And so I usually use this particular visual because it helps us to kind of frame the depth of racism in society. And when you see an iceberg, only 10% of its mass is actually above the surface. And 90% of an iceberg's mass is below the surface. And that's what's dangerous, is what we can't see. And that's what's holding all of this up, are the things that, again, we've not actually unpacked and understood or interrogated in the way of policy process, resources, budgets, systems that, again, confer advantage and disadvantage along the lines of race. So when we're talking about equity, racial equity in particular, it's a way of distributing resources that takes all of this into account and ensures that strategies, interventions are targeted to get to a universal outcome. One of the questions that very often comes up in this work is, well, aren't we striving for equality? And equality references the distribution of resources, assuming sameness. It assumes that everyone is equally situated and operating under the same set of conditions. But because of historic policy and practice that has, again, generated this generation over generation of advantage and disadvantage, that's not the case. Everyone is not operating under the same conditions. And so when we have a universal outcome, we have to understand that we've got to take targeted interventions or steps or strategies, again, that take those things into account to ensure that everyone can achieve that goal. So I think most people have seen the example of, kids at a fence watching a game. That has been deemed problematic for a whole lot of reasons, but this is just another a way of thinking about the difference between equality and equity, and recognizing that equality can actually make any inequity worse. It can actually deepen disparities on a particular issue. Again, when the distribution of resources or the application of a process or policy is not actually, again, taking into account the differences and conditions that have brought people into a particular space or opportunity. So again, back to thinking about racism as a system, I think this is a helpful quote from Donella Meadows, who was one of the, like a founding voice in terms of systems thinking. And she talks about, if you want to understand what a system's purpose is, it's not always easy to determine, particularly if we're paying most attention to the stated goals of a system. But the purposes are deduced from behavior, not from the rhetoric or stated goals. And so I usually pull this out and ask people to reflect on that, because if you really step back and look at how your system, whatever system you operate in, how it moves and what its results are, regardless of what we state our values are around diversity, equity, and inclusion, is that actually how you're moving? Is that actually what the behavior of your system reflects? And so if the results don't reflect it, you take some steps back to figure out, well, what are my interactions in the daily decisions that I make? Am I taking this into account? You might get a different sense of what the system in which you're operating, what its purpose is. And so taking again a systems lens and understanding to this work that it's not necessarily, again, about individual intent. It is about the ways in which this system operates very much on its own. Racism does not, or systemic racism does not need bad actors to do what it does. The system was designed this way, and so it's operating the way that it was designed. And what it's indicated by the number of folks that are on this call, that what our work is today is to figure that out and to start interrogating the system, undo the damage, but also undo those policies and the processes that keep it in place. Okay, next slide. And in doing this work, there are features that are very common in taking on racial equity, race lens investing strategies, or anything around race lens work in general, that it's explicit and it's race informed, that again, you're understanding the history of place, maybe of issue or industry, or of a subject, and that is actually informing the decision-making that happens moving forward, and that you're naming what it is that you're trying to address. It's got to be explicit. And so one of the pushbacks, or one of the questions that often comes up is, well, what about all these other groups that are marginalized? And I use the frame of, race explicit, but it's not exclusive. And so when you're leading with race and being explicit about it, it actually opens up opportunity to understand how race impacts and intersects with other identities as well. And it keeps it on the table. And so that opens up the space to have conversations about how ability, gender, identity, orientation, et cetera, and how all these things intersect with race. And so being explicit about that is really important in the work. You cannot fix a problem that you cannot name. Stakeholder engagement is really important, and not just in a kind of passive or a box checking way, that engagement and understanding is actually influencing decision making, that this work is outcomes oriented. What is the long-term impact in the system that you seek to have? So 9 times out of 10, when we're talking about these investment strategies, we're trying to figure out how to generate a return, or how to align values with the process that's going to operate within the institution. But the institution is a system within a larger system. And what is the opportunity for influence or impact in that larger system in which you operate based on where you sit? Systems or structural analysis is part of this work as well. And so, as I mentioned before, understanding the history and what has brought the difference in conditions about, and then looking at that work through the lens of policy, of practice, of resource distribution, and of the cultural norms around a particular issue. It helps to have a culture of practice so that you can build the muscle for doing the work, and developing your racial literacy and the fluency to talk about a lot of these concerns. You know, if you're in an investment committee meeting and, you know, very common questions come up around some of this work, how do you respond and how do you know how to respond? That takes practice, it takes skill, it takes competency. And so working with joining different conversations groups so that you are, again, developing that culture and the muscle for doing the work. It's data driven, the ability to collect data, disaggregate data, and analyze data is the beginning and the end of some of this work, because we've got to have a baseline understanding of what's actually happening. So disaggregating data actually lets you know how different communities or different types of groups are faring on a particular issue. Thinking about how we're talking about this work is actually equally important. Our brains are wired for storytelling, so ensuring that we are actually questioning, challenging some of the stories that we've been told over time, and how do you reshape those stories when it comes to access to capital, when it comes to notions of risk. What are the things that, again, are just generally accepted, haven't been interrogated, but they are, again, also shaping how we approach this work. And finally, it's relational, that this requires us to be in contact and relation very often with people who are not in our normal circles. So we live in a hyper-segregated society, and so this requires stepping outside of the boundaries that have been established over time, and actually being in spaces and in places with people who may not normally be together. Next slide. So I know this is all about impact investing, and so I did want to provide just a little bit of framing for that. And so when thinking about how to apply race lens to your work, your impact investing strategy, there are two ways of thinking about this. One is the actual strategies that you're deploying. And so, you know, from the profit only investing all the way to the impact only investing, and the spectrum of ways that money can be used in alignment with meaning. How you apply a race lens you can think about it in terms of strategy. And it's similarly as you're developing your impact investing, the actual things that we're putting resources into, and the actual outcomes that we seek to achieve based on the investment strategy. Next slide. But the other way of thinking about this, and it's not a either or, it can be a both and, but another way of thinking about this is actually what your role is in a capital chain and what are the practices that you're deploying at the same time. So what is the lens on how we go about selecting our managers? What are we asking our consultants to do? How is our investment committee being developed, and how are they being supported to think about this work more intentionally? Do we have a diverse investment committee? So it's both practice, but also strategy. And so what we'll get into today is some ideas, some thinking, some experience for both. So we can actually exit out of this now. And thank you so much for sitting through my very brief workshop.
And we'll share those slides as well, just so attendees know. Yeah, they can have those slides. Thank you.
So we have with us today Michael Dermer, who's the founder and CEO of the Lonely Entrepreneur and the Black Entrepreneur Initiative. Hi, thank you, Michael, for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Bert Fjois, who is the advisor for foundation management with Community Capital Advisors, and is the former senior vice president of investments at Silicon Valley Community Foundation. Hey, Bert.
Hi. Morning.
And Tiffany McGee, who is the CEO and founder of Pivotal Investments and a CNBC contributor. And I also, full disclosure, sit on the board. I'm an advisor to Pivotal Investments as well. So hi, Tiffany, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Okay. So let's go ahead and jump right into this conversation today. So I appreciate you again for being here. And I'll start with Tiffany. Before diving into the how, can we talk a little bit about the why and why it's so hard for BIPOC founders and managers to actually get access to funding?
So funding to start their businesses, I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
Funding to start businesses, to grow businesses, in terms of the entrepreneur side of it, but also why is it so hard to get funding in terms of the manager side as well?
Yeah, so I think two things. I think it's important, and first of all, just thank you for kind of level setting with all of that information, because I think, you know, in the work that you do, and really everyone on this panel does, there's a lot of, there's an educational component to it. So the first thing is the metrics that are used to identify managers, to allocate to managers, to make investment decisions, I believe are somewhat outdated. And then when you think about getting capital to start a business, you know, that is, getting capital to start an investment firm is very hard. And so just to kind of put things in perspective, John Rogers, who's the first African-American to ever have an investment advisory firm, started in 1983, right? So John Rogers has Ariel Investments. Many of you might know him. In full disclosure, he sits on my advisory board, but he was the first, right? 6 months later, Eddie Brown came, and so on and so forth. When you contrast that to the fact that Morgan Stanley started in 1931, right? When you even look at Goldman Sachs starting in 1869, that's 114 years before. And I understand that, you know, Ariel Investments is not Goldman Sachs, but we're just talking about investment firms. And so many of these investment firms have been around for a very, very long time. And what happens, everyone knows Goldman's pedigree, even Morgan Stanley and these types of firms. People get their start there, they spin out, and they do very well. And they're almost like breeding grounds. And a typical scenario is, and not just from a very big firm like a Goldman Sachs or a Morgan Stanley, but even from some of these like really successful private equity firms. When, and I would say traditional people spin out, the common narrative, a lot of times those people get to take some of their clients with them, because that firm understands that, wait, if this person was, let's say, very successful within my organization, and you know they're spinning out, and I want to make sure they're successful, because then people know that so basically our firm can kind of take a little bit of responsibility for their success. A lot of times when, and I'm just going to say Black, you know, people in that same scenario spin out, they're just not given that same type of support. And the narrative is, more often than not, why would you leave that firm? You had such a good situation at that firm. You were getting paid well. You were, you know, you were leading, you were making investment decisions. And so that's really, that's a common narrative. So when you spin out, you know, you start at zero. And a few things are very important in the investment industry. It's not just capital to start a business, because yes, systems and software, all these things are very important to be able to do our job. But more importantly than that, or just as important as those things, is track record, right? So your performance over time. Some people can you claim your track record, right? Well, if you don't take any clients with you, you can't. How long have you been in business, right? If you're just starting, that's a bit of a challenge. How long has your team been together, right? And so sometimes you spin off with other people, right? So there are any number of scenarios. But what is more important, I think, as someone who started a firm, who launched a firm, I've launched 2 firms, more important than a bank loan or a grant. Lately, so much, so many grants and things for Black entrepreneurs. More important than those things are your first clients. Who is going to come with you, right? And no one necessarily wants to be the first one. And so that is a really, really big challenge. So, and then you'll have consulting firms, right? Much like mine, even though we do not do this, that are really kind of like the gatekeepers. They're standing in between that fund manager and the ultimate client, call it a foundation, call it a pension, or what have you. And they're standing in between making those decisions and making decisions about allocating. And that, and they have this rigid criteria. So they'll say, hey, we need you to have, and I'm just going to make this up, 80 million in assets under management. Well, if you're just starting out, you don't have that. Or if you are, first going to, if your first customers are friends and family, traditionally, if you look at the racial wealth gap in this country, when I started my firm, my parents love me, my family loves me, and would do anything for me. They don't have hundreds of thousands of dollars to give me. They just simply don't have it. So it is systemic, and I'm just so glad that you kind of level set. It is systemic. There's some things that we really have to get over in order to start having this conversation. We have to alter the metrics. And when I say alter metrics, it's really expand metrics. A lot of people will say, well, are you asking us to lower our standards? No. I'm asking you to broaden your horizon, to understand that there may be a person with a whole lot of talent who was sitting at a previous firm, who had investment decisions, who had investment making responsibilities, making investment decisions, who has now decided to start their own firm. And they were good at what they did. And they may not be able to claim SEC track record because they can't pick up those clients and take them with them. But you can also look at what they did, and you can consider that. And so those are the things that we do in my firm. And by the way, my firm, I can't believe in 2021 or even in 2020 we're still having firsts. But my firm is the first Black woman-owned institutional consulting firm in the country, and I halfway say that with pride, but then the other half, it's like, why am I the only one? And I think one of maybe two Black firms like mine in the country. So we're still, we're still challenging things. Yeah.
All right, so Tiffany, you already touched on like 5 different questions I was going to ask later on around metrics and other stuff. But you did touch on structure.
Really exciting. So
right. You touched on structural barriers that exist when trying to access, again, those practices. That's the decision making around manager selection, for example. So thank you so much for that. And shaping a lot of how that's viewed and how that decision making, again, is actually creating advantage and disadvantage by not taking those historic issues into consideration. So Michael, we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the Black Entrepreneur initiative that you're supporting, and what is that experience, or why did you launch that with a focus more on small businesses or the growth of Black entrepreneurs?
Thank you so much for having me. I came from some of these institutions. I started my career as an M&A lawyer in New York, and had built and sold a healthcare business. And after I did that, I wanted to give back to entrepreneurs. And I was just struck by the fact that while entrepreneurism was so important to our society, we never gave people a map. We said, just go figure out on your own. And so we launched the Lonely Entrepreneur, a 501c3, to basically build a one-stop shop, a platform. We did that in 2015, but Erica, as you know, in 2018, we started to say to ourselves, how do we help women and people of color who face these additional systematic challenges that we face? And so we partnered with economic development leaders throughout the country that now number about 60 Black leaders throughout the country, where we basically said, entrepreneurism isn't of itself as hard, but then the Black community faces additional challenges and opportunities. So we built out that platform, and we were working on this with these 60 great leaders. And unfortunately, we all know the George Floyd events, and we said to ourselves, while we all wrestle with social and economic injustice, we have a platform that we can put in the hands of people today. So we launched, as you said, what we call the Black Entrepreneur Initiative, to try to put this platform in the hands of 100 Black men and women for free. So that's what we're trying to do.
Okay, thank you. So Bert, you bring a different point of view as someone who had actually moved through this process, right? Like, so you went on a personal journey and an institutional journey all at once, basically. Can you talk a little bit about the experience from the Silicon Valley Community Foundation and even how that's shaping kind of how you're viewing this work and the emergence of a lot of race lens investing conversations today?
Yeah, and I'm still on that journey. Learn every time we have these conversations, so thank you. There's a couple of points of why would a foundation or a donor with a fund at a foundation invest in racial equity. And I think first and foremost is that it would be imprudent not to. A foundation board and an investment committee has a fiduciary duty to earn a rate of return that supports the mission of that organization. And by considering every qualified manager is part of that duty. And if you're excluding a group of capable, talented asset managers inadvertently or because of structural racism, because they happen to be women or people of color, you're leaving alpha on the table. And that's not a smart thing to do, and it's imprudent, and it's not fair. So I think first and foremost, foundations should look at their values of accountability to their stakeholders, their constituents, to their communities, and that should be the driving force. And additionally, if we think the diversity of asset class and diversity of investments is important, then it also follows that diversity, cognitive diversity, diversity of ideas, how you're sourcing ideas is also important to moderate risk and generate returns in a portfolio. So on that point, it's the smart thing to do and it's the prudent thing to do. Second is, and I don't hear folks talking about this much, is the transformative power of institutional capital to really change systems. And you might ask, well, how could my small investment really move the needle? How can I make any difference? But it does. It's philanthropic capital in particular that's often the thin edge of the wedge, as they say, that provides initial capital. It funds a new idea. It funds a new manager. It makes it safe for follow-on capital to come in, and ultimately for larger capital like pension capital that can't write small checks. Right? They're excluded from small emerging managers or managers that are willing to cap their assets to preserve returns. And so there is a real power in institutional capital to change systems. And then the last thing that I would touch on is specific opportunities to invest in investments that are addressing racial equity and social justice, either by investments that are benefiting individuals and communities that have been harmed by these systems in the past, or in new ideas that are helping to change institutionalized racism. And there are a growing number of opportunities every day. I see them pop up on my emails and my feeds, but in Harlem Capital Partners and Venture Capital, American South Real Estate Fund and Real Estate. When I was at Silicon Valley Community Foundation, we used cash initially. I put $8 million of cash with Self-Help Federal Credit Union to help them expand lending in low communities across California. So there's no shortage of actual direct investment opportunities as well.
That's actually an excellent segue into the next set of questions. And so let's go ahead and dive into the allocation of capital and who's doing it, and even some of the things that may have been unanticipated in getting that work done or getting that work done now. So very often, Black, Indigenous, other people of color entrepreneurs have been locked out of the positions that are making these investment decisions. So whether it's sitting on the investment committee or actually, again, making a decision around allocation of capital. And so foundations are now, looking at increasing diversity on their own boards, their investment committees, and even staff to address these concerns. I think the DAMI initiative has been doing surveys of consulting firms to look at the diversity of consulting firms. And so I guess specifically Bert and Tiffany, in crafting strategies, what is the significance? What is the role in that? So we'll call it stakeholder engagement to a degree. But how important is that? And what are some of the strategies that you've seen to actually get more voices on and in those decision making, if not the roles in that process? So Bert, I'll come back. Let's start with you. You started down this pathway, and then Tiffany, I'll ask you to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, it really starts with the governance of the investment practices and policies. I think there's the two biggest barriers to actually allocating more capital to managers in an equity-focused manner are, one, the gatekeepers, those responsible for sourcing talent and recommending and bringing those ideas to the table. So those are your investment consultants and your investment staff. And second, it's the those who shape the investment policies and practices, which is ultimately the board and the investment committee. So it starts with good governance practices. Again, starting with the board and nominating committee, getting diversity on the investment committee, having these conversations, making it a priority, holding the gatekeepers accountable for demonstrating an inclusive process for sourcing managers, meeting with managers, recommending managers, holding them accountable. As you said, data is real, it's got to be data driven. You know, annually show me your numbers. How many managers did you meet with? How many were women? How many were minority? How many were Black? How many were Asian? How many were Latino? How many were indigenous? How many did you recommend across your entire client base? How many did you hire? Show me that you're, and you as a firm, if we're talking about an investment consultant, what are your practices around diversity, equity, inclusion as an entity? And what are you doing to integrate these practices into yours? So I think really those are the kind of the two main areas. You know, and just full disclosure, Eric and I are working with another community foundation right now on this very topic. And it started with a racial equity assessment of their DEI practices, looking at their committee charters, their consultant contracts, their staff job descriptions, and their engagement with their stakeholders. So it's intentionality around really digging in and looking at your processes, policies, and practices.
Thank you. So Tiffany, from where you sit, anything to add to that list, but then also what are some of the challenges that investors can, or pitfalls they can potentially avoid in taking this on intentionally? And how might you recommend they get around them?
Yeah, I think Bert is spot on. I mean, it really comes down to the consultants, the gatekeepers, and the board. And I'll shed a little bit of light on that. You know, the board, the investment committee, however, the particular institution really kind of makes decisions. Sometimes it's in a smaller subcommittee. They have so much power over the consultant, power over the investment policy, power over everything. So the intent has to be there. But I also understand, you know, these committees or these boards are sometimes they're, you know, 4 people, these smaller committees, sometimes they're 10 people, sometimes it's the whole board, sometimes they're 17. And building consensus. So there may be people listening right now. And if you're listening to this, you're probably interested in kind of implementing something, a strategy towards a racial equity within your investment portfolio. But how do you build consensus? Everyone on your board may not feel like this is an important issue. So I think that understanding that it's not just as simple as, oh, the board can make a decision. We're going through a situation right now. If, you know, it's an institutional client whose consultant has not been doing a good job and was referred something like 10, 12 years ago, still has a friend on the board, has been underperforming, and it's been allowed to go to happen year after year after year. And they'd like to bring us in. We're having to play what I call inside baseball. To say, okay, well, you know, who's in the board? Who can we talk to? You know, because you can have these conversations and really helping the people on the board who want to get a different consultant, first and foremost because they're not meeting their investment goals, but second of all because they want to look at a diverse consulting firm. helping them figure out how do I do this? What kinds of things? And so we've had to win at least 3 times, and we haven't even gotten to pitch yet. So there's a lot of that goes on. But I can also say, as a gatekeeper, I know, and I hate that term gatekeeper, but Bert's absolutely right. Because that's what we do. We select managers. We manage investment portfolios, and part of that is selecting managers to manage some of it. I don't necessarily ask my clients the question if they're into diversity. I already know. If they are, then they've made it known. I don't go to my client and say, hey, I've got a manager of color or a woman who's a manager, that'd be great. I just say, hey, you know what? We're in the small cap international space, I have a manager that did 45% last year, and the MSCI did 14%. I think this is great for your portfolio. Happens to be Eddie Brown, who happens to be a diverse manager. I don't have to have that conversation, right? The numbers speak for itself.
Sure.
Yeah.
So thank you, and that's an important point as well, right? That highlights that when it's asked for and when it's not, is there an incentive? But when it's baked into the approach, that doesn't have to be part of the conversation as well. So how gatekeepers, I know, tackle that work becomes important. So Michael, I'm going to turn to you for a little bit, because you're on the ground, like you're working directly with entrepreneurs in general, but through your Black Entrepreneur Initiative, a very focused approach. So one, in this time, it's not unusual, right, to see something that is that explicit about supporting Black entrepreneurs. So I'd like to ask you about your decision to do that in this, where we're still hearing, even some pushback about why something like that would be needed, or even being that explicit about the frame. So one, if you could talk about that, but who is investing in Black entrepreneurs from where you sit, and how could an investor potentially get involved either in the work that you're doing, or getting connected to make those types of investments, either through donor advised funds or through very clear investment strategies?
Well, listen, my motivation was pretty simple. I was a white kid that grew up in central New Jersey and went to Bucknell and Northwestern Law School, right? I had no idea what it really meant until I started spending time with, Lanier Richardson, the head of economic development for Cory Booker, and church leaders throughout the country. And, the company that I built, a healthcare company, which was the first to reward people for being healthy, almost got destroyed in 2008, and I built it back up. And I thought that was hard until I actually spent time in the Black community. And then I understood, well, shouldn't say understood, appreciated what hard was. And what you realize is that when we think about this broader topic that Bert and Tiffany are discussing about, kind of social impact, even some of the great efforts, and Bert, you mentioned Harlem Capital, even some of the great efforts, like, for example, around social impact investing and investing in Black entrepreneurs, those investment portfolios might get 500 Black founders coming. They might invest in 10. And that's great for those 10, right? But when we're talking about, as you said earlier, equity, right? The people that get to venture capital, sure, they of course need, and we should have more of those funds, but how are we helping the 500, right? And how are we helping beyond the 500 that might not even get to the level, to your point before, about not having friends and family capital and experiencing pattern bias and all that stuff. So our whole thing was, how can we be quote unquote on the ground, right, to be able to put something in their hands? And so for us, having a platform where we can do that made it easy. The way, very simply, Erica, the way that we make this free to Black men and women is by working with corporations and philanthropies and economic development organizations and saying, if you believe your social justice efforts are served by empowering Black men and women to be entrepreneurs, how can we work together to take some of your funding and put these tools in the hands of Black men and women through our initiative? So that's what we're trying to do.
And so if you could have a conversation, which you can right now, with different types of investors, how would you recommend they start to be intentional about this work? Again, from where you sit, like you are on the ground and engaged directly with Black entrepreneurs. What are some of the opportunities from where you sit to make those types of investments?
I would say two things. I'll give you an example of our partnership with the Milwaukee Bucks. The Milwaukee Bucks provided us some funding, and on Martin Luther King Day, within about 48 hours, we had 600 entrepreneurs sign up for the program because they got it for free. And so the next day, they're having a quote unquote better chance of success, even given, as you said, Erica, some of the systemic things that exist. I would say secondly, and so, of course, we're happy to talk to folks about, but I think secondly, when we talk about social impact investing, it is incredibly important, of course, to create other capital sources for Black founders. But there are many, many Black founders that will never get in front of a social impact fund. So I think part of the capital that these social impact funds have, especially for the Black community, should be to help teach them how to fish, given not just the normal challenges of being an entrepreneur, but obviously the systemic challenges that they face with respect to being a Black entrepreneur and some of the issues that you mentioned earlier.
Okay, thanks. So let's see, given where we've talked about up to this point, and this is a bit of a master class. I'm enjoying this actually myself, just hearing from all three of you. It does matter, again, who these different strategies are serving. And so, we talked, Michael, you have been really focused on Black entrepreneurs. Bert, can you speak to some of the broader effort that was happening at Silicon Valley Community Foundation, or, how social justice and racial justice have been tied into other strategies beyond the practices, the investment management practices that you all undertook? Were there other strategies that you deployed as well?
Yeah, we had a special program that I think was fairly unique in helping donors with donor advised funds invest for impact. So I had the privilege of underwriting many different impact investments for a variety of, not just for racial equity, but for a variety of interests of the individual donors. Could climate change, sustainable foods, health, a whole variety of things. One thing I learned through that process was that people often get hung up. You showed that continuum of ESG, SRI, MRI, PRI, this kind of alphabet soup of different vehicles and the strategies, and people get lost in that and don't know where to start. And I've worked with large, sophisticated, both asset managers as well as asset allocators who think they're talking about one thing, and by the time we've worked through it, it's something else. So I guess my point there is, don't get hung up on the mechanics. Be really clear on what problem you're trying to solve, what your objective is with that money, and then also the source of that money and what constraints you have around it. A donor advised fund may have a lot more flexibility in what it does, unlike an endowment that is trying to meet a 5% payout and has a full investment committee and a process to work through. So the diverse manager work that we did was the most specific example of what Silicon Valley Community Foundation was doing, and specifically working with its investment consultant as a lever of system change, realizing that if we could, that Crucial Partners was the investment consultant, was Colonial Consulting at the time, they changed their name, but realizing that by working with a investment consultant that worked with the entire field, that we would have a much greater impact. And so that was where the focus was. Since then, the foundation has launched a Black Entrepreneurs Fund and has done a lot of work now in funding Black entrepreneurs and Black communities. So the work continues there.
Sure. Okay, thank you. Just a reminder to our participants, please go ahead and drop any questions that you have in the chat or in the Q&A. You can direct it to any of our speakers or just kind of put it out there in general. So we can make sure that we are addressing any specific questions that people may have along the way about how to apply this to their work a little bit more directly. So I'm going to switch gears just a bit and Tiffany, ask you to talk about ways that investors can actually can activate. And so within a community foundation, there are different types of constituents that are involved in that work. And you know this even from your work at the Baltimore Community Foundation. So you've got professional advisors, you've got donors, you know, you've got board members, but are there ways, that you've seen that people can, again, just start to activate on some of these ideas and start to bring a race lens into their, if not institutional, some of their individual strategies?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just very simple. If you are someone who's a part of an organization, whether you are staff or on the board or, on the investment committee, or whether you're involved even as a volunteer, I would say, my all of my clients are institutional, and so I think particularly when it comes to the foundation piece, foundations like to get feedback from the community that they serve, and I don't know if Bert wants to chime in, but even from the people who are doing this work alongside of them, yes, donors, but just people who are involved with their missions. I think that they look for that feedback and they want to be seen in a good light. So I think there are a number of different types of entities within, related to an organization who can bring this up. And I think that's where it starts. And number one, just bringing it up if it hasn't already been brought up, and number two, discussing it and asking questions. So how do we go about this? But also understanding that this is not just a good thing to do, and it's not charity. Bert mentioned if you're not being intentional about this, you're leaving alpha on the table, you're leaving money on the table. But then understanding too that there may again have to be some education to for the decision makers to help them understand that I think a lot of this is just subconscious. The investment policy was written, I don't know, 20 years ago. We just updated it. Yep, looks good. Keep on going, right? And so that's got to be, if you're going to be intentional about allocating to emerging managers or allocating to managers, allocating to diverse managers, that should be in your investment policy statement. So understanding all of these things that need to be done before, so that you can have an inclusive investment program, and getting that education again around how you just started, Erica, how you started our conversation off today, I think was a great level set that a lot of people just aren't really aware of. This is an actual discipline, right? Across all industries, not just this one, but you kind of have to know what you're going into before you start a program.
Great, thanks. Michael, did you have anything to add to?
Well, I think that, one of the things that we're trying to do is to, if you think about all the systemic issues that we're trying to break down, and, those are worth breaking down, but will take time. And so our approach to this is, how do we put tools in the hands of people today? And obviously there's, as Bert said, there's so much enthusiasm for trying to make a real impact. And as corporations, philanthropies, and donor advised funds and social impact funds want to have that impact, we all believe that we're aligned in trying to help Black men and women who may not even call themselves entrepreneurs. They may be entrepreneurs by choice, by necessity, or just doing their side gig. So I think that while those largest systemic issues are addressed, as Bert and Tiffany mentioned, we're just trying to put tools in the people's hands that need it the most.
Okay.
Hey, Erica, I don't mean to, can I just add one thing that I just thought of too? I think some organizations might carve out a space for impact, and they're focused on impact investments, right? Like a pure impact investment, like venture or something like that. Allocating to a diverse manager, again, in most cases, these are entrepreneurs, and that has impact. When you are able to, especially, when Bert talking about the power of institutional dollars, to the transformative power, that is impact. So, I would challenge everyone not to be thinking about impact in this one little bucket off here, off the side, that you're only thinking about managers that are stamped, we're an impact fund, we're an impact fund. When we bring on big clients, it means the world to us. It means the world to our entire firm. So, and that is,
Another way.
amazing impact.
Well, there's so many.
Can I tag on there?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the conversations I've had with diverse managers, what Tiffany just said is so true. The two main takeaways that I've learned was, one, these managers are so grateful for your confidence and trust and allocation that they are going to work as hard as they possibly can to get you a meaningful return. And they're going to introduce you to other managers who I can assure you are not on your most consultants, not even in their database, let alone on their radar. And then second, as Tiffany was saying, and Michael, these managers, and this is particularly true in private assets, hedge funds, private equity, venture, they sit on boards. They influence who the CEO is. They replace CEOs. They have their service providers and networks. They place people on boards. So the impact of this capital and how it then impacts the diversity of the vendors, the board members, the CEOs, the C-suite members, the actual companies that they're investing in and the communities that they're investing in, and the products and services, it really does have an impact.
Thanks so much. Okay, so we're starting to get some questions. So I'll throw these up. These are from our audience today. So one of them came from a Black founder of a 501c3 organization, launched an accelerator recently to help Black entrepreneurs, young Black entrepreneurs. So can you recommend reputable organizations or companies that they can join to build relationships with donors and investors? And I think that's actually, we'll expand that to, like, are there networks that are useful and reliable and supportive for more of this conversation where people would want to lean in? So that's open to anyone. And I think that can be at a national level, doesn't necessarily have to be a regional one, but that we'll take anything right now. So.
Yeah, I can chime in a little bit. I think both on a national and a regional level, there's the corporate and philanthropic community is weighing in on a lot on this, right? So a good place to start is you can start locally and look at organizations. There are many kind of consortiums and roundtables that have come together and say, how do we empower, for example, Black men and women to be entrepreneurs? So look locally first. And then on a national basis, obviously, there's, especially in light of COVID and the impact it's having on the Black community, you hear these dramatic statistics that, 41% of Black-owned businesses may not make it through COVID. I mean, if it was 4%, it would be tragic. And so on a national basis, there are some of the, as Bert said, some of the largest foundations in the country are really trying to weigh in. So the local is good to start, but I think it's actually worth looking at large organizations that do it nationwide as well.
The one organization I'll mention is here in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, headquartered at the East Bay Community Foundation, is a program called Ascend BLO for Black-led organizations. And they have really good information and programming around supporting Black-led nonprofit organizations in particular, not entrepreneurs, but it ties in with supporting the entrepreneurial community. So that's a resource you may look at.
Tiffany, are there any others that you would recommend or places?
Yeah, and I think, I don't know if I heard the question correctly, but in terms of just support, and I'm big on kind of finding your tribe. NAIC, National Association of Investment Companies, is kind of like the trade organization for diverse managers in the alternative space, and also New America Alliance is a trade organization for Latinx managers, and that's like your support system. I've leaned on both of those groups. The Solange Brooks, who's the CEO of NAA, is on my advisory board. These people have done this before, and they're there to kind of definitely help navigate you as you are starting off, and just point you in the direction of resources.
Thank you. So we have another question. If you were to create a new investment option with a race equity lens in a portfolio, what are some examples of the types of investments that you would be sure to include? So I guess that's a ideal circumstances. You could have anything that you want. What would you include? And that's up to anyone.
I guess that's probably a me question. We're actually doing it now. So we're, again, a lot of times we'll see foundations who carve out a certain amount, a pocket for impact or ESG. And meanwhile, the other 95% of their portfolio is invested in things that undermine their mission. So one of the things we're doing is customize index funds, because the conversation is not just this linear conversation about investing in managers of color or diverse managers or not. It's, okay, what is the risk tolerance of the organization? There are some foundations that have, most of their money is in index funds because they're really risk averse. And, so you have to deal with that issue. They're still having a conversation around active versus passive management. So what we're trying to do is build in ways and figure out ways to meet those managers, to bring in those managers into the portfolio in the other 95% of the portfolio. So, lean in terms of like the customized index funds, right? Get out the junk that you don't like. But then also, what managers can I look at, diverse managers who are managing cash, right? We've got one manager on our platform, diverse manager. You guys probably all know who he is. He did almost 10% in cash last year. That's insane, right? So really being creative about how we can bring diverse managers and that talent into the other 95% of the portfolio. So customized index funds, cash, all of those different things.
Okay.
I'll chime in here. I think you can do this across all the asset classes. So I actually would not create a new segment, because then I think you're perpetuating the same problem, which is diverse managers always get a slice of the mandate, not the full mandate when they're fully capable of it. And that's just perpetuating the built-in racism. That said, you might think outside the traditional large cap, mid cap, small cap, international, and think more along the lines of global equity, or core satellite approaches, where you have your lower cost index core, but then you've got highly differentiated specialty managers who can go anywhere to find alpha. Those are going to open up opportunities to bring in more managers, and because there is a status quo bias with all your existing managers of you've got to let somebody go to let somebody in, unless you change up your allocation and how you think about it. So I would do that. Second, if I were to add something, I'm a firm believer in the power of CDFIs, community development financial institutions, as one of the best conduits for effectively providing capital to local communities and in an equity focused manner. And I think of them as the vehicle, and foundations and donor advised funds as the gas. So, like Michael said, get to know your local CDFI infrastructure or lack thereof, and either help build it, or invest in who's already there, or figure out where the gaps are. Maybe there's policy gaps, maybe there's affordable housing gaps, maybe there's small business lending gaps. But that's and there you can just use cash as a really powerful vehicle, or long-term debt or guarantees. There's lots of different ways, but it really starts with understanding what the needs are in your region, and then getting to know what best practices are in other regions. Like Michael said, look at high-performing CDFIs in other areas, and then help build that ecosystem and partner with those people in your area.
Okay. So I have another question. How do you involve diversity in the decision-making table? So what are some of the strategies to get your investment committee or staff, or like how do you bring those voices intentionally into these conversations such that they're again influencing the decision making? So what are some of the recommendations around increasing diversity? Again, board level, staff level, investment committee, then how that starts to impact some of the decision making.
Now I'll take a
you have a response, a ready response.
I'll do it a little bit from an investment committee perspective. We talk about the existence of pattern bias, right? That an investor has not seen this before. Well, isn't that what every investor is looking for? I mean, isn't every investor looking for what they haven't seen before? So I'll use an example. If you're an investor and you are looking at fashion, music, food, art, and you're not talking to the Black community, you don't understand history. And so while some of the motivators are the motivators we're talking about here, some of the motivators should be, I'm going to miss out on the next big thing, because if we think of all those areas, almost all of those areas, the next big thing was all shaped by the Black community. So risk of loss of returns is usually a pretty big motivator for people that are making investment decisions.
Yeah, and I'll add from my experience working with investment committees. Like Tiffany said, they're all different sizes, different compositions. Some are largely volunteers who aren't even board members. Some are all board members. Some are, have been around on the committee for 12 years. I think it starts with your board leadership, the nominating governance committee, intentionally looking at the composition of the investment committee. In my experience, the investment committee is the last place where the change happens, and it almost has to be imposed as a mandate from the board. I sit on the UC Davis Foundation, and this is exactly the process that's happening now, as we're drafting DEI principles and beliefs, guiding principles, and ESG guiding principles and beliefs. It took board leadership and the nominating governance committee to step in and say, no, this really is important. You, the investment committee, this is part of your charter and your responsibility. So that, and look at your charter, look at the terms. Do you have staggered terms? So you're constantly bringing in new people with new ideas. Is there a way to bring in diversity intentionally over time? Or are you stuck with, oh, we don't have any terms. We just have some folks who've been on this committee forever and we trust them. Status quo, again, bias. So there's some ideas there.
And I'll just throw in there, Tiffany had mentioned NAIC or New America Alliance. There's the National Association of Securities Professionals. All these different organizations hold regular conferences and events and are places to show up, kind of change who you're hanging out with and change where you're making connections and networking and actually generating ideas and connections for this work. So just again, expanding the places and the spaces that you're occupying. So we have one more question before we transition away from this conversation. And it was a question about whether the panel could address the role of capitalism in perpetuating systemic poverty. And are there, I'll add this part on, are there ways that these strategies or this intentionality can start to address that? Is this changing the system from within, if you will? I know it's a big, hairy question.
Well, I just want to make sure I understand the question. Are there ways that, like, the role that capitalism has played in this, or ways that
what it's played? I think the question is what the role of capitalism has played in perpetuating poverty, systemic poverty. And my question as a follow-on is, are there ways of thinking about what we've talked about today that can actually shift that it can start to change that? Are we essentially trying to change the system from within?
Well, I think if you think about it in the sense of competition underlying capitalism, and people starting with a foundational set of tools, resources, money to be able to do that. Obviously, some of the stuff you mentioned before, Erica, about the racial wealth gap and all the things that you started out the presentation with. create a different set of foundations, right, for the Black community that they have to make up for, which certainly in my context, in the context of entrepreneurism, is incredibly difficult to do. So I think that in the same way that a market works within capitalism to pick winners and losers in a good way from competition, we also have to recognize that those gaps are systemic, right? So how do we fill those gaps with, loan guarantees at anybody who's gone, for example, for an SBA loan, most companies don't qualify for it because they need tons of collateral to do it. So how do we take some of the policies, right, and fill some of the gaps so that the foundation that people start from, everybody's okay to compete, not the least of which is the Black community, right? We talk to entrepreneurs all day. They're like, we're happy to compete. We just want equal footing, and they're not starting from equal footing. So I think some of those mechanisms have to make up the gaps.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I think Michael's absolutely right. I mean, I started off by giving some stats in terms of years in which Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley were founded. And you have to also, remember that in those times, actually it was 1839 Goldman Sachs. So we're really talking about slavery. Don't get my dates, Erica, because I know you know everything, every single date. But in the 1800s, like, it was illegal to teach us how to read. Like, we couldn't read. So talk about, not starting from the same point. I mean, we can start from there, probably even, before there, but it's been an entire, situation. The narrative has been playing catch up. So I see this thread kind of woven through everything. Again, Michael mentioned SBA loans. I would never, I've never gotten a loan for my business ever. I've had to, and not that I even really tried, but I know some of the things that you need to do that, and so there are just a lot of options that are closed off. But again, it comes back to these metrics. Even, when corporations are being intentional about diversity, it's usually with vendors, not with their professional service providers. So if I'm selling widgets, I can be a vendor to XYZ corporation. But since I'm an investment advisor, it's like, oh, no, those decisions are made in the finance department. And the finance department could care less if, from a corporation standpoint, not a foundation standpoint, the finance department can care less. And that person, those people are usually going to their network and their community. So it is definitely some bias, but that's how it's perpetuated. That's how, in this one example that I gave earlier, that's how a very, very large it can have the same consultant for 12 years who's underperforming, and it's okay.
Sure. Bert, I don't know if you had a closeout comment on this as well.
Yeah, it just starts with asking questions. You showed that impact capital chain, and sitting at the top of that chain are the asset owners. And so it could be your personal portfolio with your financial advisor, it could be your donor advised fund, it could be your foundation. It starts with asking those who are managing the assets on your behalf, what are your practices? And asking all managers, all service providers, all consultants, all your banking relationships, brokerage relationships. It's, what are your DEI practices as a firm? What are your beliefs? What are you doing to address systemic racism within the financial system? Show me the data. Show me that this is important to you. And if it's not important to them and they're not doing anything, go somewhere else. Because that is, the power is in the asset owners' hands. That's where it starts.
Okay, thank you. So I certainly appreciate, again, everyone being here with us today. Thank you, Bert. Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you, Michael, for your time. And thank you, everyone that was in attendance. So I will turn it back over to Abby now.
Yeah, thank you, Erica, and thank you to all of our speakers. We all want to be allies in this fight together and in this work. So I'll just turn it over to our president and CEO, Brad Hurlburt, to close us out.
Well, just thank you so much to the panel, Erica and to Bert, Tiffany, Michael. We just appreciate so much. You know, we're on a journey. We're all on a journey. This has been really, really enlightening to us. And as a community foundation, we want to use all of our power, and that includes our investments. And this has really been really, really helpful. So I just want to thank you all and Abby for putting this all together. So we wish everyone a wonderful day, and thank you so much for all your insight and information. Thank you.